Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you who are in London, Paris, or Europe. We are very honored and grateful to have again Professor Mary C. Rawlinson to give a Zoom talk in our critical theory seminar. I'm just gonna say a few introductory words about Professor Mary Rawlinson, and in order to make it easier, I'm just gonna be doing a very quick presentation. Professor Rawlinson is Professor Emerita of Philosophy at Stony Brook University and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at University College London. She's published numerous works covering different areas such as Hegel, bioethics, global health, social justice, aesthetics, philosophy of literature, Proust, contemporary French thought. And among her major publications, we can list Just Life on Bioethics and the Future of Sexual Difference. What is sexual difference? Thinking with Irigaray, which is about to come out by Stony Press. The Routledge Handbook of Food Ethics, Engaging the World, Global Food, Global Justice, Labor and Global Justice, Essays on the Ethics of Labor Practice Under Globalization, and two major works on Thinking with Irigaray, and the other one, Thinking After Irigaray. So she has a trilogy that has been co-edited by Professor Rawlinson on Irigaray's feminist philosophy. And she did one of the first publications on Jacques Derrida and feminism from 1997. We're very grateful to have Professor Rawlinson with us. I'm just emphasizing again, these are three major works on Irigaray, the one from 2011 on Thinking with Irigaray, the other one on Thinking After Irigaray, Engaging the World, from SUNY Press, the Gender Studies Series, 2016, and this most recent publication, What is Sexual Difference? Thinking with Irigaray. Professor Rawlinson, thank you again. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nita. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me again. I had such a good time in our last conversation, and I hope this one will be equally entertaining for you. I'm just going to mention one other text that Nita didn't mention because it's relevant to the paper that I'm doing today. This is a book on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit called The Betrayal of Substance, Death, Literature, and Sexual Difference in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It came out in 2021 in the middle of the pandemic, which I can advise you it's not wise to publish a book in the middle of a pandemic, but nonetheless, it is relevant to the paper I'm giving today, so that's why I mention it. The paper I'm going to present today is going to be published next month.
Right before bed. It's like,
sorry?
Broke off or something.
Would you please turn off your mics? Would you please mute your mics? Thank you. Please go ahead, Professor Rod.
Oh, okay. So the paper I'm going to present today is going to be published next month in Bloomsbury's project on 20th century French thought. Now, most of the work I've done recently on Irigaray has focused on her ethics and politics and the implications of her work for issues of structural injustice, including food justice, gender justice, climate change, colonialism, decolonialism, and so forth. So much of that work is addressed to a real interdisciplinary audience. But the paper I'm going to present today is a philosopher's paper. It's really about the impact of Irigaray's work on fundamental concepts in metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology. So I very much appreciate having this audience to discuss this paper with. Nita gave me a time limit of 45 minutes. I think this is going to be a little bit briefer than that. And so let me thank you in advance for your attention and your patience. And without further ado, Irigaray's Revolution. So I want to begin with 3 epigraphs from Irigaray, first from Sorcerer Love in An Ethics of Sexual Difference. A revolution in thought and ethics is needed if the work of sexual difference is to take place. We need to reinterpret everything concerning the relations between the subject and discourse, the subject and the world, the subject and the cosmic, the microcosmic and the macrocosmic. Everything, beginning with the way in which the subject has always been written in the masculine form, as man, even when it claimed to be universal or neutral. Secondly, from my left to you, the natural is at least 2, male and female. All the speculations about overcoming the natural in the universal forgets that the natural is not one. The universal has been thought as one, but this one does not exist. And finally, from democracy begins between 2, it is better to have possibilities for the future than to be already totally determined by the past. With the publication of Speculum de l'autre femme, Speculum of the Other Woman in 1974, Luce Irigaray's thought of sexual difference inaugurated a revolution in philosophy and its fundamental conceptual commitments. The concepts of time and space, subjectivity, nature, matter and form, transcendence, the universal, logic, language, and ethics have all undergone an indelible transformation through her intervention. Irigaray's radical revolutionary gesture consists in undermining the logic of the one or the same that governs metaphysics from Plato to Hegel by insisting on the irreducible at least 2 of human existence. And let me note that while Irigaray focuses on sexual difference and the 2 of male and female, she regularly inserts this at least. She has sometimes been accused of heteronormativity because of her insistence on the necessity of rethinking the relations between men and women. And she has sometimes been accused of discounting or even suppressing other differences, whether of sexuality, race, or class. This at least, however, cannot be ignored and makes such charges unfair. The at least 2 marks a respect for other differences. It signals the way in which her thought of sexual difference invites and welcomes the thinking through of other differences. So human existence is at least 2. Man, Irigaray argues, seems to have wanted directly or indirectly to give the universe his own gender, as he has wanted to give his own name to his children, his wife, his possessions. While philosophers in the West have systematically erased the existence, experiences, and bodies of women as philosophically irrelevant, Irigaray over and over again exposes this erasure to reveal how man's false transcendence is constructed out of an appropriation of the body and experiences of women. Whereas these philosophers have identified human experience with a generic rational subject to which each and every singular being can be reduced so that each one recognizes himself in the other as the same, Irigaray repeatedly demonstrates that the difference of the other proves irreducible, a difference that cannot be overcome by any concept of a common sense or generic human rationality. Moreover, she explicates the way in which one's own subjectivity, temporality, and transcendence depend on this indelible relation to the other. Indeed, as Irigaray demonstrates, it's only the relation to the other that keeps time and the world horizon from closing up in a circle of infinite repetition of the same. After Irigaray's thought of sexual difference, philosophy can never be the same again. Philosophers can no longer proceed as if the difference of sexual difference made no difference. So, part 1, Hegel and the logic of the same. Over the course of her writings, Irigaray engages with almost every significant figure in the history of Western philosophy, from Plato and Aristotle to Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. She time and again uncovers the erasure of sexual difference and the implication of that gesture for metaphysics, ethics, and politics. In each engagement, Irigaray exposes philosophy's dependence on the fiction of a generic rational subject to which every singular being can be reduced without remainder, a subject that in every case is always already marked masculine. No other single engagement proves as critical to her project as her reading of Hegel, as it is Hegel who effects the closure of the autological circle in the history of metaphysics, the completion of the metaphysical project of a self-constituting self-transparency or absolute knowing. Philosophy has aimed at, as Irigaray remarks, organizing the world into a significant whole at the disposal of the subject. The world would then double what exists through a gathering that makes it available, in particular by designating, naming, and setting into a whole all that exists. Though later in this passage, Irigaray goes on to criticize Heidegger's idea of language as the house of being, time and again throughout her writings and in her most recent work, Sharing the Fire, she focuses her critique of metaphysics and the logic of the same on Hegel, who undertakes the project of transforming substance into subject, into language, and who means to say the whole, the one truth in the narrative of absolute knowing. In Hegel's philosophy of absolute knowing, each singular being counts as only an instance of the whole, and each one is governed by the same univocal logic. Thus, the aim of Hegelian dialectics, as Irigaray argues, is nothing less than reducing difference to sameness. In his phenomenology of spirit, Hegel means to establish the logic of the same through the articulation of all the possible forms of consciousness and all the possible forms of objectivity in the system of their genetic relationships. Beginning where he finds himself, with the certainty of immediacy, consciousness pursues a methodology of self-interrogation in which he attempts to say what he means or to articulate the certainty of his experience. This philosophical practice will generate a series of shapes, each one more comprehensive than the last. The phenomenological interrogation terminates at that point at which, quote, knowledge need no longer go beyond itself because nothing is other to it. Every domain of experience, every possible object will have been articulated and positioned with respect to other domains and other objects in this completed series. Thus, all that exists will be captured in a concept, named and designated, as Irigaray remarked, by its position in this conceptual whole. Irigaray does not impose the figure of the autological circle on Hegel's text. Hegel himself explicitly insists on the circularity of absolute knowing. Quote, for the self-knowing spirit, just because it grasps its concept, is the immediate identity with itself, which in its difference is the certainty of immediacy or sense consciousness, the beginning from which we started. Thus, absolute knowing closes this circle. The necessity of this series is guaranteed by the genetic relationships. The interrogator will not have, quote, imported any of his own bright ideas. One shape will come necessarily out of the one that, each shape will come necessarily out of the one that precedes it. The series of shapes generated one from another through the self-interrogation of consciousness will have been implicit in sensuous immediacy all along, just as the oak will always have been implicit in the acorn, or the man is the truth of the boy. Thus, from the beginning, the methodology of this philosophical subject will have ensured in advance, quote, quoting Irigaray, a gathering or closure of the whole of finite things that results in the world closing up even in advance in a circle. The interrogation will have purified immediacy of its opacity and substituted for its substance the lucidity of the concept, so that any singular existence is always already anticipated in this conceptual logic. The closure of the circle, achieved in absolute knowing, the thought of the whole, will put an end to history, as all the possible forms and shapes of cognition or life will have been articulated. As Irigaray frequently points out, from the non-perspective of absolute knowing, everything is determined in advance by the history of the subject's own self-interrogation, and the openness of the future is closed off. This thought opens the way for a pure logic, detached from sensuous experience. Substance has been transformed into subject and subjected to the life of the concept, in which life, the mortal, and the sensuous count only as concepts. Phenomenology and Hegel's repeated insistence that the concept is only realized as the infrastructure of life are left behind for a pure logic and a transcendence that is the same for each and all. And this is really the argument of the book on Hegel that I mentioned earlier. As Irigaray argues, the closure of Hegel's autological circle results in a future already determined by the past. In Hegel's account, the thought of absolute knowing puts an end to becoming and releases the pure I from its adherence to the substantiality of the determinate shapes of consciousness and objects that exist in time. Spirit necessarily appears in time, but, quoting Hegel, just so long as it has not grasped its pure concept, that is, has not annulled time. Absolute knowing, then, strictly speaking, does not exist. It is not subject to the flux of becoming, nor is it differentiated within itself as to what it is and what it will be. What the thinker of absolute knowing can be will always already have been prefigured in the system of shapes of consciousness and forms of objectivity that he has articulated. The stillness of absolute knowing, the repose of the pure I of pure thought or logic, is the same for each and all. Despite his insistence that the truth of the concept lies in its function as an infrastructure of life, as the carpenter's concept is made real as the infrastructure of the table, Hegel would free the concept from its immersion in life, from time, from becoming, in order to install a master narrative that anticipates the other in advance, bending becoming back on itself in the autological circle. For absolute knowing, space is secondary to time as the externalization of the subject's world horizon, and this conversion of time into space closes off becoming and makes the future a repetition of the past. Quoting Irigaray, when the world corresponds to the transcendence projected by a single subject as the horizon of the totality of all that exists, the world converts time into space. Although such a transcendence represents a temporal project on the part of the subject, the fact that this subject ensures, from a unique standpoint, the gathering or closure of the whole of finite things results in the world closing up, even in advance, in a circle. Hegel's determination of space as the stable shape of time, or the externalization of becoming, closes off the horizon of the other by incorporating it within his own as the same. The determinate differences of each one make no difference to the pure eye of logic that knows itself to be the movement of the concept, not a shape or form of life. The death of the individual will leave no trace in the eternal tides of generations. Hegel writes as if he could detach the movement of thought from its immersion in life, so as to think the concept in itself, freed from becoming. Hegel writes as if the book had no signature, as if it were the auto-narrative of spirit itself. The philosophical project of saying the whole of experience produces a subjectivity, as Irigaray argues, deprived of an origin in singularity. It will correspond to a whoever, a someone, or anybody, defined by a world that existed before it. It enters an anonymous, impersonal, indefinite world, a world of ones or there is. The relation to the other is imposed by a common belonging to a world that is already there, end quote. As Irigaray diagnoses, under the logic of the same, there can be no relation to the other as other, for here each is the same as the other. Each one is substitutable for the other, so as to make singularity and mortality philosophically irrelevant. Taking the idea of the eternity of earth and generation as the transcendental horizon, Hegel, after so many deaths of so many selves along the way of the phenomenological interrogation, after such a long road of looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it, after insisting that the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it, renders mortality philosophically meaningless. The mortality that singularizes each and every one must be erased so that the difference from the other makes no difference. Part 2, Irigaray's revolutionary difference. Against this logic of the same, Irigaray refutes the concept of difference. Against the mastery of difference in Hegel, she exposes a difference that must be thought and maintained as difference. She embraces the necessity of thinking a difference that the subject cannot overcome. The difference from the other is not merely a difference of units, that is, it is not merely quantitative, but also a qualitative difference that forestalls the reduction of the other to the same. From the very beginning of her philosophical revolution in the thought of sexual difference, Irigaray has insisted on the priority of relationship over the discreteness of its members. For the a woman, the two does not divide into ones. Relationships defy being cut into units. The irreducibility of sexual difference subverts the logic of the same so that its thought ceaselessly dismantles the assurance or closure of opposing terms. It undoes all sets of units reduced to sameness in order to constitute a whole. It shows or demonstrates that everyone does not exist. Each and every one exists only and always as someone, this one and not the others. As Irigaray argues, the philosophical attempt, Hegel's attempt, to say the whole in a master narrative inscribes the horizon of one world, however rich and comprehensive, as if it were the only one, the only world horizon. The gesture is not merely one of epistemological hegemony. The imposition of a world horizon is absolute, as if the one projecting it were the sun, quoting Irigaray now, determines meaning, appears in terms of requirements, a priori's, laws, ideals, which paralyze the becoming of a different human reality, notably by preventing it from transcending itself toward a world appropriate to it. In wanting to give the universe their gender, men have imposed a partial transcendence as if it were absolute, thus denying to the others their own transcendence. This gesture authorizes all the hegemonies of gender, colonialism, and race. And again, I should note that many texts make clear, many of Irigaray's texts make clear that man here refers to the white Anglo-European male of the law of property, fraternity, and colonialism. There are many openings here for thinking critically about racism and colonialism, as well as gender injustice. It has sometimes been claimed that Irigaray's account of the universality of sexual difference forecloses the narratives of other constitutive differences. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. Thinking the irreducibility of sexual difference as a universal feature of human experience calls for these narratives, opening the logical space for them against the hegemony of the one. Irigaray explicitly links the metaphysics of absolute knowing to racism and colonialism. Within this economy, woman has no place. As Hegel insists, when she enters into the domains of science, politics, and philosophy, she puts the domains themselves in danger. First, because she is no longer sequestered in the home, caring for the body and the blood. Because she is no longer sequestered in the home, caring for the body and the blood, she no longer ensures man's freedom for these discursive pursuits. Second, and more importantly, were she to have a voice of her own, she would endanger that logic of the same that governs these domains and guarantees their truth. Quoting Irigaray, our culture is based on a sharing of the same between those who have become the same. Within the economy of the same, truth in science, politics, and philosophy depends on the myth of the generic rational subject and the substitutability of each one for the other without remainder. As Irigaray notes in reflecting on Enlightenment philosophers of freedom, each one has asked himself about his freedom, about the freedom of his consciousness, as if it were the universal model of every consciousness. Thus, each was concerned with finding at the same time the right solution for himself and for everyone. The communities based on this logic will always find woman to be, as Hegel remarks, an eternal irony. She is at once, as Hegel himself admits, absolutely necessary as the guardian of the blood and a constant threat to the logic of the one. Her unruly material nature threatens man's mastery of nature, including the mastery of his own nature. Against this logic of the same, Irigaray's thought of sexual difference exposes an essential and irreducible alterity. Philosophy has ignored or suppressed the two-ness of human being that is essential to its generativity. The female cannot be erased in the male without this, at the same time, erasing the very possibility of generation itself. At least four fundamental differences between male and female mark human being. One is born of the same sex and the other is born of a different sex. One can conceive of a living being in her own body and the other cannot. One procreates within herself and the other outside himself. One can nourish another from her own body and the other only with his own labor. And Irigaray draws out these distinctions in a chapter of Democracy Begins Between Two. The history of philosophy has always treated woman either as a special case whose embodied existence and experience have no implications for thinking the universally human, or as an example of the human that is already fully thought and articulated in the narrative of man. Irigaray's revolutionary thought of sexual difference requires a rethinking of human experience as always already marked by the alterity of the other, and in a way that cannot be erased or overcome in a mutual recognition that depends on the logic of the same or seeing the other as myself, as Hegel would have it. This does not mean that Irigaray has abandoned the concept of the universal, rather she has revolutionized it. What is universal in human experience is this being at least two, so that each one is marked in its temporality and its transcendence toward a world horizon by a relation to the other as different, a relation that cannot be erased without closing off the openness of becoming, of time, and without installing a false transcendence that condemns each one from the start to be the repetition of a master narrative. Part 3, Irigaray's revolutionary transcendence. Philosophy in the West has always understood transcendence as the ascent of the subject toward a transcendent one, whether Plato's one, Spinoza's God, or Kant's thing in itself, a transcendent that is thought as the opposite of the sensuous. Even those thinkers like Hegel and Husserl, who develop a concept of transcendence in immanence, reinscribe the figure of a purely conceptual being outside time, a being that is always thought as self-constituting and self-transparent. In undoing the closure of philosophy's autological circle through the thought of sexual difference, Irigaray effects a revolutionary remaking of immanence and transcendence in at least three intertwined or mutually implicated gestures. Against the vertical transcendence of metaphysics, she inscribes a lateral transcendence toward the other. Against the opposition between the sensible and the conceptual, she installs the idea of a sensible transcendental. And against the philosophical vision of the end of time in the self-constituting concept, Irigaray deploys the logic of touch, both in the touch of the mother, who first mediates the child's sense of self and of having a world, and in her meditation on the self-touching lips, or, quote, the threshold that is always half open. So again, she meditates on the lips as a counter to this idea of the self-enclosed, self-constituting subject of metaphysics. The subject is always half open, open to the other. In the history of metaphysics, philosophical accounts of time and temporality have always focused on the self-intuition of the thinking subject, the problem of unity and difference in time, and on temporal intuition as the projection of a world horizon. Irigaray's thought of sexual difference requires the recognition of a more complex temporality. In the lateral relation to the other, two temporalities are linked. The future of each one is then modified, and thus the relations of past and future from which the temporal logic was built. Beginning from the two, transcendence requires a constant transiting between the sensuous and the world horizon, precisely because of the implication of the other in my experience. Because the irreducible other cannot be anticipated by the logic of the same, the appearance of the other is in principle, as Irigaray insists, each time new and unpredictable. Imbricated in the experience of the other, what I can foresee of my own being is thus partial. In the accomplishment of myself, a contribution from the other will play a part that I cannot completely anticipate unless I nullify the existence of the other as other. The lateral transcendence of the relation to the irreducible other acts, as Irigaray insists, as a tear in my temporal weaving. The other is not present to me as if they were an object at my disposal. Rather, the other always transcends our meeting, yet our becomings are mutually implicated one in the other. Thus, it is precisely the relation to the other that prevents my world from closing up into a totality that includes all beings. The lateral transcendence of the other holds open my own becoming and prevents me from paralyzing the movement of transcendence in a figure of absolute knowing. Only the relation to the other can hold open the closure of the world while providing it with limits. The other here close to me, but different from myself. This remark of Irigaray's importantly describes the other as him or her. In undoing the logic of the same and man's false transcendence, Irigaray's revolutionary thought of sexual difference reveals that the irreducibility of the other to the same implies to all others, each and every one, even those with whom I share my sex. While it would take another essay to adequately pursue Irigaray's claims about the link between the repression of the maternal bond and male power, it must be noted here that at the core of the erasure of sexual difference in philosophy lies the erasure of the mother. Philosophy has, until Irigaray, failed to think the philosophical implications of the fact that each one has come forth from the body of another. From the very beginning, my being is received from another and nourished by another. It is the mother, quoting Irigaray, it is the mother who first brings us into the world. The world she gives to us and to which she gives us is necessarily present in our way of experiencing the world and of living in the world. But the philosopher has not yet considered this. He pays no attention and even forgets this original determination of our way of being in the world. This forgetting produces both material and philosophical effects. Philosophically, this forgetting requires that the philosopher perform an a priori reversal in his experience, whereby the originary experience of the other as world horizon gives way to the representation of the other as an object of his gaze. His relation with the other will be encompassed by his own world horizon, rather than the relation of the other inscribing an horizon of transcendence within his own experience. The specificity of maternal love prescribes a new transcendence and a new norm for the relation to the other, one in which the other must be met as a specific other, who transcends the mother's world horizon. Such a meeting with the other indefinitely suspends the closure of becoming of my world horizon in the so-called adequate concept. Increasingly in her later work, Irigaray calls into question the priority in the history of metaphysics of sight over touch. A logic that favors sight over touch, whether it is a phenomenology of perception or an insight into essences, will always mediate the relation to the other by some third. Famously, Merleau-Ponty, in the phenomenology of perception, demonstrates the intersubjectivity of perception by imagining himself standing on a hill with a companion. He points to something in the distance, which his friend does not yet see. His companion follows his line of sight, and their gazes converge at the same point on the same object. For Merleau-Ponty, the third of the object mediates the relation to the other and establishes intersubjectivity. There is intersubjectivity because all share the same objective world. Here, the philosopher confuses the common sense of the perception of the object, both with the transcendence toward the other and with the continuous transit in becoming between the sensible and the idea or world horizon. What is true for perception in natural science is not true for the relation to oneself or the relation to the other, nor it is true for philosophical thought, where there is more than one source of light and where there is always a complex of mutually implicated world horizons. Moreover, the mediation of the relation with the other by the object has produced the story of the war over property that dominates political philosophy, at least from Hobbes to Hegel. In Hegel's narrative of absolute knowing, the encounter with the other is one in which each objectifies the other and experiences himself as objectified. Thus, there must be a struggle unto death to prove which is active, thought, master, and which is passive, substance, slave, or object. When the relation to the other is mediated by the object of perception, not only is the multiplicity of worlds of experience reduced to the one physical world and thought governed by the norm of one truth, but also the relation to the other is understood in terms of a logic of debt and entitlement governed by the laws of property and sexual propriety. Irigaray's revolutionary concept of intersubjectivity, mediated not by sight and recognition, but by touch and holding oneself open to the other, requires a radical rethinking, not only of the relation between subjects, but also of the relation between subject and object, mind and body, matter and spirit, the sensuous and the concept. In her essay on Plato's Symposium, Irigaray introduces the oxymoronic concept of the sensible transcendental, a concept to which she returns time and again in her various meditations on beauty. Against the metaphysical project of a vertical ascent to an absolute idea, she inscribes the revolutionary idea of thought as a transiting of the interval between the sensible and the transcendental, in which the truth of the subject is just this infinite mediation. In order to share the world, in order to undertake a transcendence that is both vertical and lateral, in which the other always already participates, it is necessary to make a space for a we are, or we become, or we live here, that does not depend on the assumption of a sameness given in advance. This can only be achieved together, not through the self-transcendence of the thinking subject on his own. This will require remaking the world and ourselves, Irigaray insists, from the humblest detail to the grandest. Rather than the project of philosophy consisting in the thinker's exhaustion of the sensible in the adequate concept, Irigaray's revolutionary thought commits philosophy to an infinite and collaborative task of negotiating the differences between the sensible and the transcendental in order to open up what she calls a more livable future. Rather than the extinction of desire in the terminus of absolute knowing, the lateral transcendence toward the other, the touch of the other, quote, preserves our longing for the infinite, not only as a driving surge toward becoming ourselves, but also as a motion toward uniting with the other in order to become the ones who we are. Irigaray's radical rethinking of transcendence calls for a concept of freedom not established in opposition to nature and the sensible, but understood as the capacity to realize the spiritual and conceptual possibilities of the sensible by remaking the world to promote the blossoming of all living beings. Rather than a freedom understood as autonomy or giving oneself one's own law, Irigaray's thought of the irreducibility of sexual difference produces a concept of freedom in which the other limits my freedom, but restores my impetus by reopening my own world. While the Western philosopher takes the world to be determined by a single center or source, the freedom of the other represents another opening, another project or center with respect to the world. One which limits my own project in transcendence, just as my own knowledge is limited by the irreducibility of the other to my understanding. These limits, Irigaray insists, force me to exist with respect to the world otherwise than through a project that exceeds or transcends the network of relations in which I am situated. The autonomous philosopher on his own, projecting himself into the beyond, exhibits only an imaginary or fictitious freedom. My freedom, Irigaray insists, remains freedom only if the other remains transcendent to me and if I respect his freedom. The relation to the other keeps me tied to my own sensibility and to the nexus of relations in which I am situated. It short circuits the spurious philosophical project of a flight to a supersensible beyond in which each would be a unit of the same. Respecting the other as a limit reveals the freedom in which being and doing are always already relational and collaborative, in which transcendence is intertwined so as to open up the project of building together a world that will sustain each and all. Thus, Irigaray's revolutionary thought of irreducible difference, lateral transcendence, infinite becoming, the sensible transcendental, and the logic of touch also inaugurates a revolution in ethics and politics. Rather than an ethics and politics governed by the law of property and laws of sexual propriety, Irigaray pursues, through the lateral transcendence toward the other, quote, a more accomplished humanity and more responsible relations between all the living beings. In touching and being touched by the other, there is the possibility, by no means assured, of escaping the logic of objectification and the mediation of human relation by the laws of property. Substituting the mediation of touch for the mediation of the thing opens up the possibility of collaborating with the other to build a truth that nourishes both our solidarity and our singularity. Under the logic of the same, philosophers have attempted to make the transit from the individual to community without passing through the thought of sexual difference. as the irreducible difference that teaches the irreducibility of the other to the same. From Hobbes to Hegel, philosophers have founded community on the subjection of each and all to the law of property and laws of sexual propriety. Irigaray diagnoses the way in which this culture installs the unconditional power of money, and so that we are no longer able to find ourselves in nature or with others. The law of property and its logic of production and consumption has led to war, inequity, and the degradation of nature to the point that Earth may no longer be inhabitable. Irigaray's revolutionary thought of sexual difference offers the hope of working together toward a different future in which the possibility of transcendence is available to each and all, and in which the built environment reflects not the concentration of wealth, the proliferation of elite zones of security, and the exhaustion of nature, but a culture of possibilities that promotes life. For this reason, as Irigaray teaches, sexual difference is the problem of our time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mary Rawlinson, for such a beautiful, profound talk. We will open the floor now. We have a question by James William. Please, William, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Mary Rawlinson. It was a very inspiring talk. I will have just a brief comment and a question that maybe it's parallel, but for me it was very, your talk made a few connections with my own work, which was surprising and good. So you brought it up, the almost fatal flaw of the intersubjectivity or otherness in Hegel's work. Well, the argument for Irigaray, right? The ontological impossibility of intersubjectivity from the one, it's a very enticing subject. So for me, it's very promising that Irigaray brings this subject, because my approach from critical theory works with Rawlsinson, and she brings the subject of forms of life, different forms of life. They are, and she brings the concept of a contextual transcending. She doesn't try to transcend above. She's trying to make these forms of life engage to each other, so they can bring some disruptive moments and some moments of empathy and sharing experiences. So the idea of this no vertical but horizontal or lateral contextual transcendence, it's very important to me. Do you see a parallel, as you said it in a later point? Do you see a parallel in the argument of a contextual transcendence and a sensible transcendence that could be, like you said, an ethical and political project that could be transposed beyond at least two, as you said? Do you see a parallel here?
Yeah, thank you for that point. That's really very interesting. I hadn't thought about that connection before, but I think you're quite right that this idea of contextual transcendence is very similar to what Irigaray is trying to accomplish in the idea of a sensible transcendental. So a couple of points here. You yourself made the point about the way in which part of the idea of the contextual transcendence is to think from immersion in life, rather than to understand philosophical thought as something that has to abstract itself from life. And this is very much something that is an important implication of Irigaray's idea of the sensible transcendental. So we have, Hegel, who wants to think from no place, right? From the non-perspective of absolute knowing. And again, this always occurs to me when I'm thinking about Hegel. It's as if he thinks spirit is writing the book itself, right? He's writing from nowhere. And Irigaray is arguing that we're always thinking as someone from some place. So philosophy is not like science, right? It's not as if the philosopher is like the scientist who's a kind of rational observer for which all other scientists are substitutable. That's essential to science, right? I mean, everybody has to be able to replicate my experiments in order to confirm my truth, right? And we're operating in a physical world under one sun. But philosophical thought doesn't operate in the physical world, right? It operates in what Irigaray would call the spiritual world, in which, as Proust says, there are as many suns as there are, great philosophers or great artists. There are many ways of constituting the world as spiritual human beings. And the purpose of philosophy is not to reduce all of those to a master narrative in a kind of univocal vertical transcendence, but to proliferate them, right? So we have many different ways of thinking about the world. There's an example I like to use here that's very, very concrete. So in the last 3 or 4 decades, we've remade our physical world to accommodate people who are differently abled, right? We put Braille on our elevator keys. We made our curbs wheelchair accessible and so forth. Now, there's an important, very profound philosophical truth here, that we learn something universal from an experience that is very specific. The very specific experience of differently abled people teaches us that we ought to organize our world not to facilitate the flow of global capital, but to promote human agency. I mean, think about the difference in human agency that was made when the built environment was remade in these ways. This is a universal truth, which I could not learn except by looking at this very, very specific experience, right? And so what Irigaray is arguing is that we get this kind of generic account of experience where the subject is always already marked, not only male, but white and European, as if this were the master narrative of human experience. And you're quite right that this has profound ethical and political implications. Those of you who know your Hobbes Leviathan know that Hobbes repeats over and over again the triad of women, children, and savages, right? And this is the group of beings that is not included in the domain of rationality, nor in the regime of rights established by the law of property. So perfectly fine to invade a foreign territory and enslave its people because they don't belong to the ontological category of human rationality anyway. Perfectly fine to sell women in marriage or treat women as property, which was done in the UK until about 1850. So this, we're not talking about ancient history here, right? Because women are incapable, given their lack of rationality, to the sort of agency that is required to be a participant, a subject in the regime of rights. So I really appreciate this point, and I'm going to have to follow up on this because I think you're quite right. The both ontological and political implications of this idea of contextual transcendence and the idea that thought is always by someone situated somewhere, very much what Irigaray is trying to achieve through the concept of sensible transcendence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rawlinson. We have 2 or 3 questions shared here on the chat. I'll just read them up for you. The first one, regarding your Hegel book, and by the way, I just shared the YouTube link on your book on the betrayal of substance, death, literature, and sexual difference in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. You wrote that feminist readings of Hegel typically misread him on two counts. As you mentioned, Judith Butler, Sheila Benhabib, and Patricia Mills. Quote, first, they completely miss the heroic role of Antigone in Hegel's text as the avatar of spirit who inaugurates the critique of the moral insolence of reason. Far from siding with the state against Antigone, as feminist commentators suggest, Hegel insists on the legitimacy of Antigone's claim. So on your reading, Antigone is clearly on Hegel's side as an agent not of feminism, but of fraternity in the gender division of labor. Now, how do you think Irigaray's argument for the reducibility of sexual difference could be of any help here, given her failure to come up with a phenomenological account of difference?
Okay, that's a complicated question. Thank you. So again, there are 2 points I want to make about feminist misreadings of Hegel's analysis of the Oedipal plays. And the first one has to do with the way in which thinkers like Benhabib and Butler sort of valorize Antigone as the advocate of the family over against the state, and sort of accuse Hegel of, not appreciating this. And in fact, as I say, nothing could be farther from the truth. So what he's arguing against here is the Kantian idea that reason alone is adequate to establish moral judgment. And he's arguing that ethics emerges out of human relationships. It's not, we are already under ethical obligations before philosophers ever begin to think. It's not as if we require reason to give us a moral law in order to find ourselves under ethical obligations. I'm obliged to my children just in virtue of being their mother. I'm obliged to my parents just in virtue of being their child. And if we're not going to adhere to those obligations, we have to have arguments as to why, right? I mean, why did the mother abandon her children, or why was I indifferent to my parents' suffering? It's not as if we need a rational argument to establish the ethical obligation. It's established in the relationship itself. So I think this is a very profound and importantly feminist point in Hegel, that that reason is, at least in Kant, as he says, guilty of a kind of moral insolence, in that it ignores the way in which the living relationships in which we ourselves are situated are always already characterized by ethical obligations. So he's in no way trying to argue that the state completely effaces the importance of the family. This is just a misreading of Hegel. Both the family and the state are absolutely essential moments in the life of spirit. And you can't efface one in the other. That would be a kind of moral insolence. But the second point on which I think they misread both Hegel and the Oedipal plays is in their valorization of Antigone. And this occurs, I think, because they fail to read the second play, Oedipus at Colonus. Now, it's of course written last, but it figures in the order of the plays as the second play. And in this play, we very clearly see Antigone playing the classic feminine role of the helpmeet. She takes care of her father, he leans on her, and it's Ismene, who's always derided, in these feminist readings, who is actually the feminist heroine in this play. She dresses up as an Athenian warrior. She dresses up in drag and goes around the countryside trying to negotiate between the different religious and political powers that are threatening her family. And she is the first daughter who's imprisoned. And when she's imprisoned, the line reads, "No more running around," right? So the mobility of agency is really demonstrated not by Antigone, who always stays by her father's side as the dutiful daughter, caring for the body and blood. It's Ismene, who is the feminist heroine here, who transgresses all the norms of gender, dresses up as a man, runs around instead of being confined in the home, effects the negotiation between religious and political powers. So Antigone really reinscribes the standard gender division of labor, which of course Hegel himself subscribes to. And these feminist readers make a big mistake. They got to read the second play by not noting the way in which it's Ismene who transgresses the norms of gender. Indeed, I actually think Sophocles wrote Oedipus at Colonus in order to correct the heroic persona of Antigone. And you really have to read the third play in light of the second one, because why should we admire Antigone, who sacrifices herself for an abstract principle instead of responding to the call of her living sister? Ismene says, "What would my life be without you?" Why should we agree with Antigone that the abstract principle of burying her brother, the dead other, again, a feminine, a part of the gender division of labor that's assigned to woman, why should we admire Antigone for sacrificing herself in this heroic gesture, right? Rather than responding to the call of the living sister. And not only should we not admire her for this, but if you read the play carefully, Irigaray, Ismene tries to talk Antigone out of her self-sacrifice in just the same way that Antigone tried to talk her brother Polynices out of sacrificing himself in the second play, right? So she's not doing anything that Antigone herself hasn't done. She's trying to preserve living relationships over abstract principles. And as soon as she realizes that she can't change Antigone's mind, she says, "Well, I'm going to die with you." And how does Antigone respond? She scorns her. She tries to humiliate her before the polis. Right? She completely disregards her. Now, there is a very interesting interpretation of Antigone by an author whose name I'm blocking at the moment. I will give you the reference later, in which this author reads the play as if Antigone is trying to save Ismene from sacrificing herself along with her. But I think there's really very little textual evidence for this. So again, I think feminist readers are wrong on two counts. They don't understand that Hegel is putting Antigone forward in an argument about the essential role of the family in the life of spirit. It cannot be erased in the state. And secondly, they make a mistake by creating this heroic Antigone who really is just reinscribing the gender division of labor, unlike Ismene, who is the real transgressor of gender norms. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you so much. We still have 3 other questions, if you will. I'll just read them. Well, there is another question here by Camila. Let me just read this last question here, Camila, because it was one of the students asked me to read this out. Magdail asked this question. In this context of Irigaray's revolutionary interpretation, the category of a place of speech or standpoint feminism, which in Brazil, Black feminist Jamila Ribeiro has made it quite known, is very similar to Gayatri Spivak's idea of standpoint feminism, would become somehow an unnecessary category. I think that the question is to see how would you respond to these criticisms of standpoint epistemology in feminism. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understood the question, but let me try. I think standpoint feminism, again, is another path along which philosophers are trying to think the idea of cognition as situated rather than as proceeding from, no place, from nowhere, from some abstraction. And I know that in Gayatri's work, what she's particularly concerned about is giving voice to the subaltern. So you have these political theories in the West based on the law of property and claims about rationality that fundamentally reduce the other, the indigenous person, to a kind of object of use, right? That can be bought and sold and so forth. So it's very important to think about from where you're speaking, because that has ethical and political implications. And it's very important to think about the relations of power that obtain between the standpoints, right? So I see a real kinship myself between standpoint feminism and Irigaray's work. Now, I know that some charges have been brought by Black feminists against standpoint feminism for thinking feminism as if it were like a univocal point of view, right? So again, I think this is something that Irigaray opens up with her thought of sexual difference. We really need to think intersectionally, and none of these differences occurs independently of the others. Irigaray spends more time, for example, talking about class than she does about race, but she also insists on the necessity of thinking through issues of race. And here, I think she makes a very important contribution that has not been fully appreciated. And again, let me give you a little anecdote to introduce this point. Some time ago, I was teaching a small seminar on political philosophy, and we were talking about race. And I kept talking about African Americans, right? And that African Americans are more likely to be incarcerated. Race is a set of probabilities. Bad things are more likely to happen to you if you're an African American than if you're a white American. And I had these 4 Black women in the class, and I could tell that something was wrong. And I was like, oh God, what if I've stepped on some cowboy, or what have I done? And they finally came up to me after class one day and they said, you keep talking about African Americans. We're not African Americans. We're Haitian Americans. And our history and our position with respect to these issues is importantly different from people who were enslaved in Africa and brought here on boats and made to work plantations. We have a very different history and a very different position to race. And this is a point that Irigaray makes, that we have to think race with respect to geography, she says. So we can't have a theory of race, a kind of universal theory of race or racial difference or racial injustice, because the injustices of the Parisian banlieue are not the same as the injustices of Maricopa County, Arizona, or the injustices of the Deep South under Jim Crow. So I think the To the degree that the charge against standpoint feminism is true, and I think this is debatable, it depends on which standpoint feminist you're talking about, to the degree that standpoint feminists have tried to give us kind of general theory in which these important differences of position would in fact be elided, if not erased, to the extent that that's true, then it really needs to take into account the kind of specificity of racial identity and to think race, as Irigaray argues, with respect to geography. Did that answer the question that was asked?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm so glad to hear you saying this, because I totally agree with you, but of course I'd be in a very suspected position. Well, you are my great intellectual mentor. Thank you so much for this great, profound response. Now we ask Camila Barbosa to come up with her question. Please, Camila, go ahead.
Thank you, Nita. Thank you so much, Professor Rawlinson, for your talk. I was really glad to listen to you again, and I have a great time reading your paper too this week. I have a lot of insights about it, your paper on thinking after Irigaray. I guess my question is a little bit of a follow-up question, both on feminist interpretations and also on intersectionality. I guess especially on the Irigaray reception in the English language, and the feminist debate around her has really been complicated in the sense of accusing her of a very essentialist view on what sexual difference is, right? And I remember this problematic reading your paper too. As you said, for instance, if you don't mind quoting you here, just to bring it up the question, but you said like, starting from human experience, what distinguishes a woman from a man is her ability to conceive and nourish another living being with her own body. And I saw in the volume on Thinking with Irigaray a paper on transsexual and transgender, and how Irigaray thought could enter in between in this her thought of sexual difference. I was wondering if you could make some comments on how you perceive this problem, or if you think is a fair call on essentialist, and how you think we can think with Irigaray to take in account of other sexual experience as transsexual, etc.
Oh, thank you, Camilla. It's nice to see you again too. And I really appreciate that question, the opportunity to address this issue that's, I think, really important, because it kind of, I think, impedes people from reading Irigaray sometimes, and that's really unfortunate. So it's really important to remember what Irigaray is writing against. She's writing against this idea of the self-constituting subject, the self-constituting ego in Hegel, or, the soul that's self-constituting in Plato. We find it, in every metaphysical thinker, this idea that the rational subject is somehow self-constituting. And it's not accidental that philosophers in the metaphysical tradition act as if adult males sprang full-blown from the head of Zeus, right? It's, there was no becoming, there was no childhood, they were never dependent on anyone, right? So when she puts forward the two and the thought of sexual difference, it's against that idea of self-constitution that she's writing. So the universal truth in the thought of the two is each of us has come forward from the body of another. It doesn't open onto a project of trying to say what a woman is. It's not like interrogating a prospective member of the Supreme Court and saying, can you define woman? It's like my country's gone crazy, but anyway, right? That's really not what she's trying to do here. She's trying to open up the possibility of giving articulation to a phenomenology of women's bodies or a phenomenology of women's experiences. And that's not going to be univocal. That's not going to be one master narrative. The other is also the other that is my same sex. It's going to take multiple narratives to articulate the universal truth of women's bodies and women's experiences. So what she's writing against is this idea of self-constitution. What she's not doing is trying to inaugurate the project of saying what a woman is. Quite the contrary, she's trying to open up the space for multiple narratives. I would probably now be more careful about my language than I was in the quote that you read, because of course, transsexual men can give birth, if they haven't fully biologically transitioned. And of course, I don't mean to imply that all parents are male, are comprised of a male and female, not at all. But I would make 2 points with response to this, in response to this. First, it's important in giving voice to transsexual experience not to preclude giving voice to women's experience. So sometimes it seems as if you're talking about women's experience it's as if you've already erased the transsexual. Well, no, not at all. But it would be silly to assume that after a couple of generations of women giving voice to their own experience, we know everything there is to know about women's bodies and women's experience. I mean, how many millennia did it take to elaborate the story of man? Well, it's probably going to take that long to elaborate the story of women's experience and women's bodies. So I think there's a danger here in once again erasing women's experience in some kind of generic they, So on the one hand, I would want to celebrate and support giving voice to transsexual experience, at the same time continuing to pursue the project of giving voice to women's experience. The second point I would make, I would just quote Derrida: all is not to be thought at one go. So again, we have this idea that as philosophers, we have to come up with a universal that is going to generate a master narrative that's going to be the same for all of us. And that's what Irigaray is teaching us, is just not the case. My narrative is always going to require the supplementation of the other. It's never going to be adequate in itself. It's never going to be absolute. No matter how brilliant my conceptual logic, it's never going to exhaust the field of the human. All is not to be thought at one go. So this is again why Irigaray, at least as I read her, is really open, really focuses on the issue of collaboration, co-labor. So I can't do my project unless I'm already involved in your project. She really emphasizes this theme of collaboration as essential both to philosophical thought and to political practice, where we have to work together to create a more livable future, as she says. And that means listening to the other. She's, really emphasizes listening a lot. That means listening to the other and always paying attention to the inadequacy of my narrative of human experience and the necessity of the supplementation of the narrative of the other. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just read these 2 questions, because then you see if you have enough time just to give us some response. One question is regarding, it's very similar to Camilla's question. How would you place Irigaray's contribution to feminism within the wide spectrum of positions between conservative, moderate, and liberal radical Marxist feminism, or even between continental and analytic versions of feminism. The other one is a more specific question. How, to your mind, is the sexual difference to be understood, according to Irigaray, at once as ontological, linguistic, and psychological in her criticisms of Western philosophy, especially Cartesian binary models and Hegelian identity models? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the first question about where I would place Irigaray within the spectrum of feminist thought, I think one of her most important contributions to feminism is her critique of the concept of equality. And she'll often ask, equal to what, right? And so she argues in a number of different places that the idea that we're going to address the subjection of women and the erasure of women's experiences by simply extending to women the rights of man is philosophically and ethically wrongheaded. So we're going to come up with new rights and new ethical concepts by looking at women's experience. And interestingly here, I see a real connection between Irigaray's work and the work of feminists like Eva, my former colleague, Eva Kate. Eva, in her work, in straightforward analytic philosopher, never read a word of Hegel in her life, I don't think. But she focuses very much on human dependency. This is very much at the core of her ethical, philosophical account. And this is, again, I think, very close to Irigaray's idea of the way in which none of us are adequate in ourselves. We've come forward from the body of another. In the beginning, we were dependent on the other. Our thought isn't self-sufficient. Our concepts aren't adequate in and of themselves. We always require the supplementation of the other. So on the one hand, I think she really diverges from a number of political theorists, feminist political theorists who really focus on the idea of equality without seeing just how revolutionary it is once you start taking a woman as the paradigm of human subjectivity. On the other hand, I think she has a deep complicity, even with a lot of analytic feminists, in terms of the way in which this notion of the priority of the relation to the other over individuality lies at the heart of her thinking. So, you know, with a thinker like Eva Kate and her concept of dependency, I think it's very close connection to Irigaray there. I'm a little resistant to the idea too that we can sort of diagnose thinkers and, you know, categorize them or put them on a spectrum or something. I think that does an injustice maybe to the sort of irreducible diversity of feminist thinkers and how essential that diversity is to feminist thought. And the second question, can you remind me? There's something about ontology, linguistics, psychology. Oh, and relationship to Descartes and Hegel. I mean, right. I kind of want to just answer by saying yes. I mean, I think you're quite right that her thought of sexual difference has all of these implications, certainly ontological implications for the way we think about human subjectivity, transcendence, cognition, and so forth. She argues repeatedly that we can't just redistribute property and wealth, we have to change the laws of language. Right? So the whole idea that women have to hear themselves in the he, right? In the language of man is something that, again, she's very critical of. I Love to You is a whole book about that problem of how the very grammar of language, and of course she's writing in French, the very grammar of language needs to be revolutionized. And certainly in terms of psychological theory, she is quite an iconoclast. As you know, she was famously ejected physically from Lacan's seminar. And sadly, she actually cries when she tells this story. And I've said to her so many times, Irigaray, this is a badge of honor. You know, this is the guy that says language is the law of the father. No. So she spends much of her cognitive time thinking about the ways in which the thought of sexual difference revolutionized concepts in both Freudian psychoanalysis and in Lacanian psychoanalysis, which are you know, I kind of have I love Freud. He's a great writer, brilliant. You know, there was a time when he was an horizon of my thought, but you cannot disentangle the thinking of women as a man without a penis from the rest of psychoanalytic thought. It's part of the economy of psychoanalytic thought. And so I think there is this kind of, you know, for all of Freud's insight into the dynamism of the psyche and the pansexuality of experience, and particularly his amazing insights into culture and the foundations of society in Totem and Taboo and The Future of an Illusion and other works of this kind, there is a fundamental flaw in psychoanalytic theory that affects everything in the theory that cannot be disentangled. And I think it's not dissimilar to the thinking of women that we find in the history of metaphysics, where a woman is a lesser being than a man, a kind of partial man. You know, as Aristotle says, something went wrong in reproduction when we get a woman. You know, something didn't go right. Because we get this being that is defined as irrational, emotional, and so forth, against the rationality of the male subject. And no matter what thinker you look at in the history of metaphysics, you're going to get some version of this. So in Hegel, you get this sense of woman is dangerous, right? When she enters into the domain, their discursive domain, she puts them in danger. And this is very similar to arguments about dress, things as practical as dress codes, right? In the Midwest in the US, you have all these horrible dress codes for girls in middle school that are justified because their bodies will disturb boys' learning. Right? Or in certain cultures, women have to be covered up because otherwise they will, you know, provoke men to uncontrollable sexual passions. Right? This is Aristotle's idea of woman is, you know, like an unruly matter that has to somehow be controlled through laws and dress codes and, you know, all sorts of institutions. Or you get something like in Rousseau, where a woman plays this sort of helpmeet role. So she softens the rather ruthless, rational logic of man and, you know, adds empathy or sympathy to his rational political and moral judgment. You know, but in all these cases, in psychoanalytic theory, in all of these metaphysical thinkers, woman is thought as a kind of quasi-human, you know, not fully possessing or capable of those faculties or activities that are definitive of what it is to be a human being. And yeah, so I would just say, yes, you're right. I mean, she's really attacking all of those registers: ontological, epistemological, linguistic, psychological, and attacking them, you know, just throughout the history of metaphysics, I think, as presenting woman as this sort of quasi-human relative to man. And again, as she often points out, this is a political strategy, right? If women, children, and savages are quasi-humans and not capable of the rational thought that is the condition of participating in the regime of rights, then they don't have any rights. You're perfectly justified in thinking of them as property. And we see this kind of horrific logic in colonialism or in the racism of the antebellum United States, right? Of course we have to enslave the Black person because they don't have the rational capacity to be self-directing. Or of course we have to enslave the people of the subcontinent because they don't have the rational capacity to be self-directing. Our colonialism or slavery is in fact a moral duty, right? A way of taking care of the other. I've just been reading about cannibalism in relation to another project and the way in which the charge of cannibalism, which was almost universally fabricated and not about anything real, was used to justify the enslavement of indigenous peoples. You had to civilize them because otherwise they were going to literally eat each other up. So yeah, again, these ontological and linguistic, psychological interventions on Irigaray's part have a very, very profound political implication as well. And this is why I keep insisting that her thought opens up, critiques of racial injustice, colonialism, gender injustice, all forms of structural injustice. And we haven't even talked about our relation to other animals and to nature, which is a very, very important theme for her that she thinks is opened up by the thought of sexual difference as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Mary C. Rawlinson, for this wonderful presentation, this very insightful and profound thoughts on Irigaray's complex, dense, and profound contribution to Western philosophy and to deconstructionist, decolonizing reading of a Western philosophy as well. We are so grateful for this beautiful Zoom talk event and want to thank you once again, wish you the very best in London with your family and friends, and hope to see you around some other time.
Well, thank you again
so
for
much.
your attention. I really, really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to join this community. Someday I'm going to get there in person.
All right.
I know Brazil is a thrilling place to visit. Everybody tells me that. So, but thank you so much for your attention and your questions. I really profited by them.
Thank you.
So good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.